Thomas had lived in the small town for over 50 years. People knew his name, but they never truly knew him. He was a man of few words, always walking the same path every morning, sitting on the same park bench, staring at the world as if he didn't belong to it. His back was always straight, his hands folded over his cane, his expression hard like stone. Some said he had lost someone, others whispered that he had done something terrible and had been carrying the weight of his guilt ever since. For Thomas, the world had become a place he simply existed in. He spoke to no one, made no friends, and carried a heart so heavy that every step felt like dragging a chain behind him. There was only one thing that haunted his nights, the face of his younger brother, Daniel. The brother he had not spoken to in 40 years. One fateful afternoon, a young boy named Ethan, no older than 10, approached Thomas's bench. Ethan had seen the old man countless times before, always sitting in the same place, always lost in thought. But today, curiosity pushed him forward. "Hello, sir," Ethan said, hesitating for a moment. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Thomas glanced at the boy, his cold grey eyes studying him. He said nothing, just gave a small nod. Ethan took it as permission and sat down. For a while, they sat in silence. Thomas expected the boy to leave when he realized the old man had nothing to say. But Ethan stayed, swinging his legs and looking up at the sky. After a while, Ethan spoke again. "Do you ever talk to anyone?" Thomas exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, but it was bitter. "No." "Why not?" Thomas didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. How could he explain to a child that his heart had turned into a prison long ago? Ethan looked around the park. "My grandpa always says that talking helps when your heart is heavy." "Is your heart heavy, sir?" Thomas turned his head slowly and looked at the boy. No one had ever asked him that before. People had judged him, whispered about him, pitied him. But no one had ever asked about the weight he carried. "It doesn't matter," Thomas said after a long pause. Ethan shrugged. "I think it does." That night, as Thomas lay in bed, memories crashed over him like waves against the shore. He saw Daniel, his younger brother, laughing as they ran through the fields as children. He remembered their late-night talks, their shared dreams of leaving the small town and making something of themselves. And then he remembered the fight. It had been over something foolish: money, jealousy, pride. Thomas had accused Daniel of stealing from their father's inheritance. Daniel had denied it, but Thomas hadn't believed him. Harsh words had been exchanged, and in a fit of rage, Thomas had told Daniel he never wanted to see him again. And just like that, their bond had shattered. Years passed, and Thomas had heard that Daniel moved to another city, started a family. But Thomas never reached out. Even when he heard that Daniel had written him letters, he had refused to open them. He had buried his pain under the weight of his own stubbornness. But now, lying in the dark, he felt it, how heavy his heart had become. The next morning, Ethan was there again, waiting at the park. Thomas sat down beside him, staring ahead. "You're persistent." Ethan grinned. "My mom says I'm stubborn." Thomas gave a small smile, the first in years. "It's not always a bad thing." Ethan kicked at the dirt beneath his feet. "Do you have family, sir?" Thomas hesitated before nodding. "I had a brother." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Had? What happened to him?" Thomas swallowed. "We fought a long time ago. We haven't spoken since." Ethan frowned. "Do you miss him?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Finally, he sighed. "Yes." Ethan tilted his head. "So why don't you talk to him?" Thomas looked at the boy, surprised by how simple the question was. "It's been too long," Thomas muttered. He probably wouldn't forgive me. Ethan shrugged. My dad always says that holding a grudge is like carrying a heavy backpack. It just makes you tired. Maybe your brother's tired too. Thomas's chest tightened. He thought about all the years he had wasted, all the nights spent resenting himself, all the mornings waking up with regret. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe Daniel carried the same weight. That night, Thomas did something he hadn't done in decades. He pulled out an old box from his closet. Inside were the unopened letters from Daniel. His hands trembled as he picked one up and read the first line. Dear Thomas, I miss you, brother. Tears blurred his vision. He had spent years believing that his brother had moved on, that he had forgotten him. But here, in his own hands, was proof that Daniel had wanted to fix things. And Thomas had ignored it. It wasn't too late. It couldn't be too late. With Ethan's words echoing in his mind, Thomas made a decision. The next morning, instead of going to the park, he went to the train station. He had found Daniel's last known address, and he was going to find him. The journey felt like a lifetime. His heart pounded as he stood in front of the house, his hands shaking. He knocked on the door, and when it opened, he saw a man with grey hair, familiar eyes, and a face that had aged but still carried the same warmth. Daniel stared at him in shock. Thomas? Thomas's throat tightened. He had prepared 1,000 words, but now, all he could say was, I'm sorry. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Daniel's face softened. Without a word, he pulled Thomas into a tight embrace. The weight Thomas had carried for 40 years suddenly lifted. As they sat together, talking about the years lost, Thomas realized something. Holding on to pain had only hurt him. And in that moment, he understood what Ethan had been trying to tell him. A heart that forgives carries less weight than one that holds grudges. And finally, after decades of suffering, Thomas was free.